Yeah, so today we're going to talk about Wittgenstein, and I've got a sort of plan. So I'm going to start off by talking about two different interpretations of Wittgenstein, what we might call the kind of traditional reading and the new reading. The traditional reading, I think, reads Wittgenstein in a certain sense as a sort of mystic who thinks there are things that can't be said, but that can be sort of shown. Yeah. Whereas you've got this new sort of reading that's known as the resolute reading. And the resolute reading says that when Wittgenstein says everything in this book is nonsense, he actually means it. Yeah. So we're going to look at these two different readings of Wittgenstein's project in the Tractatus. My sort of take is I tend to be, oops, there's more people coming. So maybe I'll just wait for a minute and then I'll sort of start. Hi, Darren. Yeah, I'm saying we're just about to start with Wittgenstein, and I've got a sort of plan for today. So I'm going to start off by talking about these two different readings of Wittgenstein. Then I'm going to, which will involve looking at the preface and then at the conclusion. Then I just wanted to say a little bit about Russell and Wittgenstein's relationship to Russell and sort of Russell's project and the relationship between Russell and Wittgenstein. And in particular, I want to say a little bit about Russell's notion of logical form. Yeah, and so it turns out that Russell thinks that in order to understand a proposition, we need to be acquainted with its constituents, but we also need to be acquainted somehow with its logical form. And so this question about the logical form of a proposition or a judgment was a kind of central area of debate between Wittgenstein and Russell. Yeah. And it's a bit weird, it's a bit hardcore, but I think there's enough of it that's sort of understandable to get some idea of what this fight was about. And in particular, the logical form of the most basic form of a judgment is something like predication. F is A. Yeah, so to understand someone saying A is B, the cat, Lucas is happy, you have to know what Lucas is, you have to know what happiness is, but you also have to know what the is of predication is. Yeah, so if we have a judgment like Lucas is happy, the form of that judgment is going to be something like predication. And Russell thought that in order to understand any sort of subject-predicate judgment, we needed to understand that we had to have some grasp of logical form. And Wittgenstein writes this whole book about, in some sense, about meaning, about language. And at the end of the book, he says that everything I say in this book is nonsense. It can't be understood. Yeah. And I think one of the sort of ideas, he says it can't be understood, it can be shown. Yeah. So I can show you something that can't be said. And I take it at least one of the things that Wittgenstein is central to Wittgenstein's project is this understanding of logical form. And I think it's our grasp of logical form is something that I think Wittgenstein thinks can only be shown, it can't be said. So I'm going to start off by talking about these two different interpretations. I'm then going to talk about Russell, and the goal of talking about Russell is to get to the end of this discussion in Russell, where we have the idea that the logical form of a judgment, to understand the judgment, one has to somehow grasp logical form. And Wittgenstein, I think, his sort of approach to logical form is that logical form is something that can't be said. I can't tell you what the logical form of a sentence is, but somehow I can show you. This is the kind of traditional reading of Wittgenstein. So that's my plan for today. I've got a couple of handouts, and I'm not sure how much I'm going to go through them. So let me hold on. Let me go to my folder. Yeah, so the problem is Dropbox, rather stupidly, Dropbox doesn't let you share anything that is actually open, which is really annoying. So let me send you these handouts. So I've got a handout on Russell on acquaintance. Yeah, and this is I want to say a little bit about logical form. And then I've got a handout that I probably won't get to today, which is sort of about the main body of the Tractatus. And this is something hopefully I'll start talking about tomorrow. And what I've basically done is the Tractatus is divided up into these propositions, and I've taken out the key propositions, what I take to give you something like the backbone of the argument in the Tractatus for you to look at. I don't know who's read Wittgenstein before. Bashak, was that a yes? Has anyone, did you take a class or you just read it for fun? Has anyone else read any Wittgenstein? If you read it for fun, it probably wasn't the Tractatus. Did you look at the Tractatus or the investigations? The Tractatus. Okay, cool. And how did you find it? Was it comprehensible or boring? Boring. The Tractatus. It's like sexy murder poet stuff, the Tractatus. Yeah, I think the Tractatus is sort of quite wild and crazy. It's yeah. Okay, so let's start off with these different interpretations. So in the preface and at the end of the Tractatus, Wittgenstein sort of suggests that at the end, he sort of says, if you understand what I've written in this book, you'll realize that everything I've written is nonsense. Yeah? I mean, how can that be boring, Bashak? You write a whole work of philosophy, the conclusion of which is, if you understand me, everything I've written, you'll come to see is nonsense. That's quite cool. Yeah? So Wittgenstein's claim is that if you understand him, you'll see that everything he's written is nonsense. Now, what do we mean by nonsense? Yeah, what does Wittgenstein? Well, it's something that doesn't have sense. Yeah, so it's not something that describes the way things are in a certain way. So there's some sense in which the philosophy Wittgenstein is doing, and philosophy in general, is not making claims about the world. It doesn't have any empirical content. It's, in a sense, it's meaningless. Now, the question is, though, exactly in what sense is it nonsense? Like, so the sort of traditional view is that Wittgenstein says that has this idea that the sentences really are a nonsense, but by reading them, you can come to see something. So Wittgenstein is trying to show us something with language rather than telling us something. Yeah, and what he's trying to show us, another, you know, there's something mystical, there's something ineffable, something that can't be described linguistically, but one can use language to show us this. Yeah, and this is the sort of this is the sort of traditional reading that Wittgenstein thinks that even though he's saying stuff that is nonsense and is in a sense meaningless and doesn't have any cognitive content, that his language, if you understand him, you'll come to see something that he sees. Yeah, so that his use of language is such that he thinks that he's able to use senseless language to really show us something. So that's the sort of traditional reading. But in the last kind of 15 years, there's been this new reading that's sort of known as the resolute reading. Yeah, and the main defender of the resolute reading is this woman called Cora Diamond. That Wittgenstein used to was very famous, but Wittgenstein was this billionaire in today's standards, from probably the richest family in Austria, and his sister was painted by Gustav Klimt, who did The Kiss. All of the major Viennese musicians would come to his father's house and would perform. His brother, all of his brothers committed suicide, apart from one who almost who was fought in the First World War and lost one of his arms. And he was a very famous concert pianist. And after he lost one of his arms, he learned to play the piano with one hand, and then got all of these famous kind of composers to write pieces for this one-hand special style of one-handed piano playing that Wittgenstein's brother taught himself. Yeah, Wittgenstein is really quite crazy. He's like one of these philosophers who there's lots of weird stories about. So yeah, so Wittgenstein. Well, I started telling you this story. Oh yeah, so Wittgenstein came from this very musical family, and he really liked to whistle. So he would whistle extremely well, and he would whistle like whole symphonies, and he would do he was an incredible whistler. So he would wander around Cambridge sort of whistling. And so one of the kind of famous anecdotes is there's this famous Marxist economist called Safra, who once said to Wittgenstein, like, if you can't say it, you can't whistle it either. Yeah, and so one of the debates has been about whether in the Tractatus Wittgenstein was trying to whistle it. So on the one hand, you've got Cora Diamond, who's the big defender of the resolute reading. Yeah. And you've got this guy called Peter Hacker. Yeah. And Peter Hacker is probably one of the best known Wittgenstein scholars, and he's a defender of the sort of traditional reading that says that Wittgenstein was quite serious about thinking that he was trying to show us something through the Tractatus. It's not absolute nonsense. That in a sense was Wittgenstein trying to whistle it, and Hacker's answer is yes. And so Cora Diamond has a famous paper called "Throwing Away the Ladder," and we'll come to see why it's called that when we look at the text. So Cora Diamond's paper is called "Throwing Away the Ladder," and Hacker has a response called "Was he trying to whistle it?" Yeah. So this is I think one of the more influential series of papers. Was he trying to whistle it? And Hacker's answer is yes. Diamond is basically no. Yeah. And so in terms of understanding the claims of the Tractatus, this has been one of the big debates in Wittgenstein scholarship. And Wittgenstein wrote the Tractatus. He thought he'd solved all the problems of philosophy. He then he fought in the First World War, and then he kind of gave off on philosophy, gave away all of his billions, and became a very bad school teacher who would beat his kids and was really quite horrible. And he basically thought he'd solved the problems of philosophy. And then the ideas of the Tractatus were taken up by a group of kind of philosophers in Vienna, known as the Vienna Circle. And these people are known as kind of logical empiricists. Later, people referred to them as the sort of logical positivists. And their sort of reading of Wittgenstein was that Wittgenstein was essentially anti-metaphysical. Yeah, he was kind of affirming science. Yeah, so probably the best known of the logical positivists now is Carnap. And Carnap, had this engagement with Heidegger. So the enemies, the Vienna Circle were like these radical leftists. And Heidegger, of course, was a Nazi. He was a Chaim Rector during the Nazi period. So if you like Heidegger, you've got to kind of think about the politics of it. And so he was this Chaim Rector that he was driven by metaphysics. And the logical positivists saw metaphysics as a form of sort of mystification, superstition, and darkness. And so they thought that their attack on metaphysics was an attack on the forces of repression and conservatism. Yeah, so they saw these sort of mystical metaphysics as sort of in the service of Nazism and the extreme right. And that's how things were in the German-speaking world in the 20s and 30s. Yeah, so the leftists tended to be pro-science, anti-metaphysics. And they saw metaphysics as essentially a tool of sort of obscurification. And so these sort of Vienna Circle, they sort of read Wittgenstein's main point in the Tractatus as basically being essentially anti-metaphysical. Yeah, that Wittgenstein makes this distinction between sense and nonsense, and the only thing that has sense is science, and metaphysics is basically nonsense. And so Wittgenstein's semantics offers us a tool for weeding out and getting rid of this kind of the darkness of German metaphysics. Yeah, the sort of darkness of and backwardness of German metaphysics. I think, along with people like Hacker, that Wittgenstein was actually a sort of mystic. That he in the First World War, he was in the trenches, he faced death a lot, and I think he had this very strong sort of mystical streak. Yeah, and so I think for Wittgenstein, it's not like all the important stuff can be said, but the important stuff is that which can't be said. The important stuff is the stuff that you can only show. The important stuff is the stuff you can sort of allude to. Yeah. So, so this is the sort of debate. And I take it defenders of the resolute reading are in a sense a bit more like the positivists. They want to say, no, this stuff is literally, the Tractatus is literally nonsense. But that's, like, on the one hand, you spend your life studying it, but then you want to say, no, but it's literally nonsense. Yeah, it's not literally nonsense, because saying something is literally nonsense itself is nonsense. Yeah, but Wittgenstein sort of, so one problem is that the resolute reading thinks that sometimes we just got to give up even saying things like it's absolutely. Does what view make Wittgenstein? Saba, can you speak, or does this?
No, I mean the resolute reading, resolute interpretation of Wittgenstein.
I'm not sure. I mean, I think that. So one thing is that the alternative reading sees Wittgenstein as a sort of a mystic. They take his claims about the mystical at sort of face value. So the kind of Hacker type reading, I think, so Wittgenstein sort of suggests that what's really meaningful to us in life can't be said. Yeah. So that which gives life meaning is not the sort of things that we can use language to describe. Yeah, but there is, but I take it the traditional view is there is something that kind of gives life meaning. There are things like values, and these are things that we can sort of allude to through philosophy without being able to say anything about it. They're sort of ineffable, but you can in some sense show the ineffable through language. You can direct, yeah. Whereas I take it, yeah, on the resolute reading, in some sense, it's a lot harsher. So, you know, like ethical statements are not, you know, I think on the sort of, on Wittgenstein's view in the Tractatus, statements of ethics are meaningless. They're nonsense. Yeah, but I think Wittgenstein thinks that these sort of things are the most important. So you know, and in the logical positivists, they took this up and had the idea that A.J. Ayer, and then after this in the 1950s, you had the kind of expressivist, emotivist view of ethics, that all that we're doing in ethical judgments is expressing our feelings. These judgments don't have any meaning, they don't have any content. When you say something is morally wrong, all you're really doing is expressing your sort of subjective feeling about it. So I think that sort of opponents of the resolute reading might want to say that this makes Wittgenstein sort of nihilistic, because he's denying the existence of values or value language, you might think. But I think I'm not sure that defenders of the resolute reading want to say that. So you know, that because being a nihilist also is something that can't be said. You know, so you know, once you've realized that all this stuff can't be said, both affirming values and denying them can't be said. And so I think defenders of the resolute reading would deny that this makes Wittgenstein a nihilist, because being a nihilist is something that doesn't, you know, what do you mean? Yeah, so if you're interested, yeah, if you're interested, this paper, Was He Trying to Whistle It, by Hacker, I think is a nice introduction to the debate. And then you have this article by Cora Diamond called Throwing Away the Ladder. So I told you a little bit about this debate. Yeah, that's the kind of first thing I wanted to do. Now, hold on, where am I now? Let's now look at the Tractatus. So I'm now going to start. So having described briefly what this debate is about, I now want to run through the sort of passages that have led to this debate, the passages, and these are the passages in the preface and at the end of the Tractatus. So let's just have a look at these passages. So he starts off by saying, so I'm a sort of defender of the kind of, I'm with Hacker on this. When I was an undergrad at Oxford, him and Hacker and Baker were doing this every Friday. They'd have this reading of the philosophical investigations. So like for 3 years, I went every Friday to there. We got through about a paragraph a week. So in the course of 3 years, I think we got through like 40 pages or something like that. But Hacker, I think, is quite good. He's got this book called Insight and Illusion. I would look at the second edition that gives a very nice overview of Wittgenstein's development, about the kind of time of that Tractatus, what happened in the 1930s when he slowly came back to philosophy, and how the position in the Tractatus sort of evolved into the position of the philosophical investigations. So if you're interested in Wittgenstein scholarship, his book Insight and Illusion, especially the second edition, I think is a nice one. We're going to be looking at the early Wittgenstein. in the early Wittgenstein, he has this notion of logical form. The later Wittgenstein, what is sort of logical form in the Tractatus, I think evolves into the idea of something like grammatical form, or and this notion of grammar replaces the idea of logical form. But there's a sort of, you can see the relationship between these two conceptions of language. Okay, so let's have a look at what he says in the introduction and in the conclusion of the Tractatus. So he says, perhaps this book will be understood only by somebody who has already had the thoughts that are expressed in it. So here he suggests that this book, even though it's nonsense, it's a book that can be understood. Yeah. So he's going to claim that literally the claims in the book are nonsense, but it's nonsense that somehow can be understood, but only if we've already had the thoughts expressed in it. Now, he says the book deals with the problems of philosophy and shows, I believe. So once again, we've got this, in this debate about how to interpret Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein says that what he says in the book is meaningless. Yeah, what he's writing about, he can't tell us what he wants what he wants, but he can show us something. Yeah, and so I take it he does think that he's in this book he's shown us something. Yeah, it shows us, I believe, that the reason why these problems are posed is that the logic of our language is misunderstood. So the book shows us that somehow philosophical problems arise because we don't understand the logic of our language. And if we come to understand the logic of our language, we can sort of get rid of certain philosophical problems. These philosophical problems sort of disappear. We can cure ourselves of philosophical illness, of having this attitude towards these problems, by coming to see that we've got a sort of false understanding of how language works. Yeah. He says, the whole sense of the book might be summed up in the following words. What can be said at all can be said clearly, and what we cannot talk about, we must pass over in silence. Now, yeah. So now the problem is that everything he says in the book, he thinks turns out to be nonsense, in the sense that what he writes is not, he's writing stuff, he's not telling us something. Yeah. And so he's writing about something in this book that we can't talk about. And his claim is that which we cannot talk about, we must pass over in silence. But why has he been doing all this talking? Yeah, this is the sort of question. Then he says that the aim of this book is to draw a limit to thought, or rather not to thought, but to the expression of thought. Yeah, so what he wants to do is to draw a limit to thought, or at least a limit to language. And, on the traditional reading, that what he does is he provides us with a sort of distinction between sense and nonsense, between things that say something and things that don't. And that really we're giving a limit of thought, of language, not a limit of thought. So he says, in order to be able to draw a limit to thought, we should have to find both sides of the limit thinkable. We would have to be able to think what cannot be thought. Yeah, so that in order to understand something as a limit, you need to have some representation of what's beyond the limit. Yeah, and so the sort of idea is that there are things that are beyond what can be said, maybe that can sort of be thought. Yeah, we can have some grasp of that which cannot be said. Yeah, what is that which cannot be said? Well, you've got the ineffable, the unsayable. Yeah, but the unsayable in some sense can be pointed to by language, without you actually saying it in language. And this allows us, I think, this is the kind of mystical reading. This allows us to understand this limit. The resolute reading thinks that ultimately that the claim that there's this sort of distinction between sense and nonsense itself is nonsense, or itself can't be thought. Yeah, and that Wittgenstein wants to get beyond this. Yeah, so he says it will therefore only be in language that the limit can be drawn. So we use language to draw this limit, and what lies on the other side of the limit will simply be nonsense. So kind of one of the key claims tasks of the book is to kind of, here he's suggesting, is to make this distinction between bits of language that are meaningful and nonsense, which have sense, and those bits of language which are nonsense. Now, you know, and the problem is given his account, it turns out everything he writes in nearly everything he writes in the Tractatus is nonsense. Yeah, so he says, now, according to the resolute reading, Wittgenstein isn't committed. So it looks like in the book, Wittgenstein is proposing a certain theory of meaning. Yeah, and the sort of traditional readings thinks that, yeah, Wittgenstein is sort of somehow committed to this account of meaning. This theory of meaning is known as the picture theory of meaning, and we're going to work it out. And so the sort of traditional reading is that Wittgenstein is providing us with a sort of an account of meaning. It turns out, though, according to this theory of meaning, the actual words he uses to explain this theory of meaning turn out to be nonsense. But you may think that they're nonsense that allow us to sort of see this account of meaning. They show us, they allow us to understand this account of meaning, even if the individual sentences turn out to be things that literally can't be said. Now, so he says, if this work has any value, it consists in two things. The first is that thoughts are expressed in it. Now he says, here I'm conscious of having fallen a long way short of what is possible, blah, blah, blah. But I think kind of here, this doesn't seem consistent with the idea that he thinks that he's not really doing anything in the book. And then he says in the final paragraph of the preface, he says, on the other hand, the truth of the thoughts that are here communicated seem to me unassailable and definitive. So here he thinks he has sort of in some sense communicated some thoughts, and he's communicated thoughts that are true. And the truth of these thoughts is unassailable. Yeah, he says, you know, I therefore believe myself to have found on all essential points the final solution of the problems. Yeah. So he thinks he's communicating some sort of truth. And these truths, in some sense, offer a final solution to the philosophical problem. This is before the Holocaust, so the final solution doesn't have the same sort of connotation. And so he says, if I was thinking in this belief, then the second thing in which the value of this work consists in is that it shows how little is achieved when these problems are solved. So Wittgenstein thinks he's basically arrogant, or what? He thinks he's solved all of the problems of philosophy through expressing this theory of meaning. This is the kind of traditional reading. But it turns out that solving all these problems turns out not to be very important, because everything important is beyond the possibility of saying. This is my reading. So that's the preface. It's a sort of very weird thing. If we go to the end of the book, I think the preface and the end of the book are kind of go together. So this is the sort of so towards the end of the book, so the Tractatus is organized in numbered paragraphs. You have the main, it's divided into 7 main sections, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then each section is subdivided. You have 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, and then 1.1 is subdivided into 1.12, 1. So the sort of idea is you can move from this one to this one. You can move from, we're moving now from 4 to 5. Yeah, and so the idea is that you've got this basic structure 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then in section 6 you've got a basic structure 6.1, 6.2, 6.3, and 6.4, and then in 6.4 you've got 6.41, 6.42, 6.43. So the sort of Tractatus is presented in numbers paragraph that have this sort of nesting relationship to each other. And in the final sections of the book, he first of all introduces this theory of meaning. He then basically uses this to offer an account of the meaning of the logical constants of and, or, and not, and quantifiers. And he basically does this in terms of offering a semantics for the logical operators in terms of truth tables. Yeah, so one reason this book is influential is that it's only 7 points. Yeah, but he basically uses truth tables to offer an account of the definition of the logical symbols. So in terms of logic, you have Frege, who kind of first worked out the basic ideas, but it was a bit of a mess. Then Russell and Whitehead basically gave the main backbone of the logic and solved a bunch of problems in Frege. And then Wittgenstein offered the sort of first semantics, explaining the meaning of the logical constants in terms of truth tables. And so he basically provided what's, I think, the standard view of the meaning of logical terms there's another view, which is the more constructivist view, but this view that Wittgenstein offers is one of the standard views about the meaning of and, not, and the like. But then towards the end of this, so he's offered a theory of meaning. He then basically gives us a semantics for Russell's logic in terms of truth tables. And then he kind of ends up going all mystical on us. So he says, he has this shift towards the mystical. He says, it's not how things are in the world that is mystical, but that it exists. Yeah, it's the that which is mystical. And how things are, this can be described. I can use language to describe how things are. Yeah, there's possible ways of how things are, and I can choose one of them to describe how they actually are. Yeah, but in some sense, that things are is something that Wittgenstein says can't really be said. Yeah, but it's that which is central. Wittgenstein is writing this at the same time that Heidegger's developing his thought. And so like you've got the kind of the followers of Wittgenstein are people like Carnap, who think that Heidegger's philosophy is all nonsense. So the big example, Carnap's got this very Wittgensteinian paper, probably his most influential paper, what's it called? The Eradication of Metaphysics through the Analysis of Language. That he takes as his example of metaphysics, Heidegger's statement, das Nichtig, the nothing nothings. And Carnap very famously said metaphysicians are musicians who don't have any musical talent. Yeah, because like there's poetry and music. Yeah, they're not trying to say anything. Yeah, but metaphysicians are like poets or musicians. They're humming, they're whistling, but they're not saying anything. But their metaphysics is like bad poetry. That's basically Carnap's picture. But I think, you know, Heidegger is the sort of founder of existential, in some sense, what you might think of saying like existentialism. At the heart of his philosophy is this idea of Dasein. Being there. But I think it's the thatness that comes before the how or the what in Heidegger. So I think this is something that, you know, is not alien to a sort of Heideggerian perspective or to an existentialist perspective. It's not how things in the world that is mystical, but that it exists. Yeah. Now, he says, when the answer cannot be put into words, neither can the question be put into words. The riddle does not exist. So in philosophy, we have all of these sort of unanswerable questions. Yeah, this is the sort of thought. And these unanswerable questions are sort of riddles. But if you've got a question that can't be answered, then Wittgenstein thinks then the sort of question is meaningless. Yeah. So questions that essentially can't be answered are meaningless questions. They're questions that just don't have any sense. Yeah. And so a lot of the traditional questions of metaphysics are like this. Yeah. And so once you come to see this, then a lot of these questions are going to disappear. But I take it that still leaves room for something like the mystical. Yeah, I think that Wittgenstein still thinks that there's this sort of wonder at that. Yeah, but in some sense that you can have this mystical side of things without having to go through philosophy. Yeah, because the kind of philosophical questions are questions that are unanswerable, and so the questions themselves are meaningless. And so we come to solve the problems of philosophy by coming to see that the questions themselves are sort of nonsense. And this is a view I think that you find in the later Wittgenstein of the investigations, where you get the idea that philosophical problems arise when sort of language goes on holiday. Yeah, and what we have to do to solve these problems, we come to see that the questions themselves are sort of nonsense. Yeah, and so rather than answering the questions, what we do is we engage in some sort of therapy that helps us overcome the questions. Now, yeah, like so he says, we feel that even when all possible scientific questions have been answered, the problems of life remain completely untouched. Of course, there are no questions left, and this itself is the answer. Now, once again, how do we read this? This feeling, is that what he wants to get rid of? That the problems of life remain completely untouched? I mean, there are no questions left that can be posed with language. Does that mean there's nothing left? So the resolute reading thinks that this is, you know, like that when all the scientific questions, there's just nothing left. And once you come to see that, then you just really can't stop worrying. Now he says, there are indeed things that cannot be put into words. They make themselves manifest. They are what is mystical. Yeah. Now, once again, I think here he is sort of suggesting that there are things that can't be put into words. I take it that on this more traditional reading that they can't be said, but you can use language to, in some sense, show these things. Yeah, that they can make themselves manifest. They can be presented to us. The thatness of things can be something that can be sort of understood in a deeper sense of understanding. Yeah. So he says the correct method in philosophy would really be the following: to say nothing except what can be said, i.e. the propositions of natural science. So once again, that it turns out that the whole Tractatus isn't this. Yeah. So he says the correct method in philosophy would be really to be the following: to say nothing except what can be said, i.e. propositions of natural science, i.e. something that has nothing to do with philosophy. And then, whenever someone wanted to say something metaphysical, to demonstrate to him that he had failed to give a meaning to certain signs in his proposition. And so once again, this does seem like you offer an argument. You have got some theory of meaning here. And once again, this seems to support, I think, the more traditional reading. Although it would not be satisfying to the other person, he would not have the feeling that we were teaching him philosophy. This method would be the only strictly correct one. So the correct method of philosophy is just to be really annoying. Yeah, that you know, you've got someone who tries to make a metaphysical claim, and then you just say, I don't understand your question. Could you explain your question more clearly? Like this word is meaningless. Could you kind of ask your question in a way that is meaningful? And then every time someone does it, you say, I don't understand, until they give up. And then you're like, see, there's no problem there to solve. Yeah. And if you do it enough, you'll come into this. So he says, now this is the claim, he says, my propositions, everything I've written in this book, serve as elucidations in the following way. Anyone who understands me eventually recognizes them as nonsensical. When he has used them as steps to climb up beyond them, he must, so to speak, throw away the ladder after he has climbed up it. So Cora Diamond's kind of, I think her best known paper defending the Resolute reading is called Throwing Away the Ladder, which is sort of alluding to this passage. Now, once again, is Wittgenstein somehow committed to the theory of meaning he's giving us? And Cora Diamond thinks no. Yeah, because the very notion of a theory of meaning is meaningless. Yeah. The kind of someone like Hacker thinks, no, he is committed to a certain theory of meaning, but he just thinks the theory itself cannot be said, it can only somehow be shown. He does think that it is possible to understand him. Now, once again, is it understanding what has been said, or is it understanding him, the master, Wittgenstein? Yeah, is it understanding his thoughts, or is it just understanding him here? Yeah, but there is some idea that you can read it and you can understand Wittgenstein or fail to understand him. You know, Wittgenstein was crazy. He broke off most of his friendships because people he thought didn't understand him properly. So he definitely had this idea that you could fail to understand him. Yeah, that there's, you know, Russell, he thought, well, he's an idiot. He doesn't understand me. No one understands me. Yeah. Yeah, we must, so anyone who, if you read the Tractatus and you understand it properly, then you will come to see that everything written in the Tractatus is nonsense. What are we to make of this? Yeah, he must transcend these propositions, and then he will see the world right. So that, you know, here we get the idea that reading the Tractatus is something that's going to change us. So the aim of the Tractatus isn't to convince us to take on a particular set of beliefs. It's more like pornography, like intellectual pornography. It's supposed to give you a sort of intellectual oomph. Yeah, you're supposed to be turned on by it, which is in some sense then going to see the world differently. Yeah, you're going to be, so that through reading the text, it's like this intellectual pornography that's going to, in some sense, change the way you see things. It's going to be affective in a certain way. Yeah. And so the point of the Tractatus isn't to get you to understand the truth of a series of claims, because the claims are things that don't have truth values, but it's to show you something. So once again, I think we do have this, that you come to see something through reading the Tractatus. That through reading the Tractatus, if you read it properly, you're going to come to see the world aright, including, I take, language. What we cannot speak about, we must pass over in silence. Why did you just write this book? You know, like, if we really must pass over in silence, yeah, like this is Wittgenstein, it is sort of, yeah, most sort of annoying. Okay, so that's the sort of, oh, that's.
Can I something?
Yeah, Dilara, yeah.
I think I'm kind of not sure what do we mean by like they don't have truth propositions.
Okay, so I mean, yeah, so my understanding of this, my sort of way of reading this is in terms of the sort of more traditional reading, where I think he is committed to something like the picture theory of meaning, and this is something he's sort of committed to, and so a meaningful proposition is one that describes the world as being in a certain way. Yeah. A meaningful proposition is one that sort of pictures the world as being in a certain way. And so you've got all of the possible ways things could be. Yeah. And a proposition is meaningful if it's some sense picturing something possible. A proposition is true if the possible state of affairs it's picturing is the way things actually are. Yeah. And so we have this idea of, Wittgenstein here kind of has this idea of truth in terms of, you know, like a proposition is meaningful if it captures something that's possible. Yeah. And so it turns out then that all the truths of mathematics and logic turn out to be to lack sense. Yeah, they don't, and anything that is necessarily true doesn't have any empirical content. It's sort of in some sense meaningless. Yeah, it's not nonsense. So the truths of logic have a status that is not nonsense, but they lack sense because they don't picture they don't picture anything. Yeah. If I say it's raining, that tells you it's raining in Istanbul. That pictures a possible way the world could be. And then the statement is true if the way it pictures the world as being is the way it actually is. Yeah. But a statement about that either it's raining or not raining fails to picture the world being in any way whatsoever. Yeah. Now, yeah, so he's got this idea of truth as sort of once he offers, this is the more traditional reading, he offers a certain theory of meaning. And according to this theory of meaning, a statement is truth apt. A statement can only be truth apt if it could be false. Yeah. Something that can't is not sort of, in some sense, it's not sort of truth apt. So he's got a notion of truth that's tied to picturing and to his sort of metaphysics. And I take it, you know, he introduces these truth tables. Yeah, that to understand what he means by truth, we have to start reading the case. Yeah, like the world is the totality of facts. Yeah, so that's what we'll talk about. I think we'll start talking about next class. His understanding of truth and picturing. I think that the Wittgensteinian theory of meaning is bonkers. It seems to me it's obviously false. And I think Wittgenstein came to reject it for, I think his understanding of, he denies, as a good Kantian, he denies the synthetic a priori. Yeah. So there is, I mean, so we've got kind of factual truth, contingent truths. We might have something like the notion of logical truth, but that's not going to be true in the same way. So why don't we have a break now? And then after the break, if anyone's got any questions about any more, or Dilara, did you want to come back to that, or did? Yeah. Okay. So let's have a break, and then after the break, we're going to talk a bit about Russell. Before I go, I gave some. I put a couple of handouts. So the Tractatus is quite short, because if you just read the 7, you've read the whole Tractatus in one sense. Let me give. I'm going to put these handouts. Oh, hold on, where are they? What? What's that, baby? Hold on. Hold on. The bed is calling. Okay. Shall we get started? So any questions about that crazy beginning and end of the Tractatus? I mean, feel free, you can ask if you want to type something. Okay. I mean, if you don't have any questions, then I just want to talk a little bit about Russell. So originally on the syllabus, I wanted you to read a bit of Russell, and then I was going to go to Wittgenstein and spend maybe a week on Russell. I just want to say a little bit about Russell, because I think understanding what's going on in the Tractatus, it's sort of useful to know the background. So Wittgenstein had come to England to be an engineer. Mohendis gibi bir insan, and he was doing aeronautical engineering, like airplanes, in Manchester. And he'd got into a bit of logic. He'd read some Russell and some Frege, and he sort of turned up one day in Cambridge at Russell's doorstep and just demanded to talk to him about philosophy. And he had this very intense relationship with Russell. He would come round. It would be like, we have to spend all night talking philosophy or I'm going to commit suicide. He was like, he's a bit of a crazy guy. He completely sort of destroyed, in some sense, Russell's confidence. He was very arrogant, very charismatic. And Russell was like the leading philosopher in Europe, maybe, at least in the UK. And Wittgenstein was this 21-year-old engineering student who just sort of destroyed him and owned him, and sort of, in some sense, destroyed his self-confidence as a philosopher. And so Wittgenstein, before he met Russell, did a bunch of stuff about the distinction between knowledge by acquaintance and knowledge by description. So there's a chapter about this in the Problems of Philosophy, and then there's an article from 1911 called the knowledge by acquaintance and knowledge by description. And I think, first of all, it's worth just knowing a little bit about this distinction. And I think the reason for this is that I think Wittgenstein's got something similar going on. And the importance of acquaintance is that for Russell, acquaintance plays a key role in Russell's understanding of meaning. So Russell, this is from his article, he says exactly the same thing in Problems of Philosophy. He says, every proposition which we can understand must be composed wholly of constituents with which we are acquainted. Yeah, so if you're going to understand a proposition, then the things in the proposition, the parts, the elements of the proposition must be things that you're acquainted with. Yeah. If you're not acquainted with the components of the proposition, then the proposition can't be understood. Yeah. So what is acquaintance? And Russell's got a very, very kind of narrow account of what we're acquainted with. Yeah. That it turns out that we're acquainted with our own sense data, maybe with ourselves, maybe with some basic properties, and that's about it. We're not, by the time Russell wrote these articles, he thought that we're not acquainted in this philosophical sense with physical objects. We're not acquainted with tables and chairs. We're not acquainted with, I'm not acquainted with Zubaydah. Yeah, that seems a bit weird, but that's Russell for you. I'm just acquainted with the sense data that Zubaydah causes me to have. And then in some sense, I know Zubaydah by description. Yeah, I know Zubaydah by description as the cause of this Zubaydah-like sense data. Yeah, so this is sort of Russell's, and I think today that after the 1950s, that this Russellian theory got sort of destroyed and everyone thought it was crazy. I think in the last 20 years, there's been a sort of return to a sort of more Russellian semantics, but with a slightly broader notion of acquaintance. Yeah, so the sort of direct reference theorists, certain of them are sort of descendants of Russell, but they have a view of acquaintance according to which you can be acquainted with physical objects, you can be acquainted with individuals and not just sense data. There's a sense in which you can have something analogous to an acquaintance relation with Plato, if you buy into a sort of direct reference theory of names. So this is what Russell says. Yeah, I say I'm acquainted with an object when I have a direct cognitive relation to that object. Yeah, so one version of direct cognitive relation to an object is going to be perception. But understanding a name, you might think gives you direct cognitive relation to the object. There's one of the philosophers I like, contemporary guys I like a lot, is Recanati. He just was at the head of the Jean-Nicot Institute in Paris, who has this book on mental files. And this is his sort of picture, that he wants to kind of have some descendant of this Russellian notion, but allows us to have this direct cognitive relation to Zubaydah, to Aristotle, and to a bunch of other things. Yeah, when I'm directly aware of the object itself. So Russell introduces the idea of acquaintance as having a direct cognitive relation, but then thinks that having a direct cognitive relation involves something like direct awareness of, experience of, sort of that you're acquainted with something that's sort of somehow given to you. When I say to cognitive relation here, I do not mean the sort of relation that constitutes judgment, yeah, but the sort which constitutes presentation. Yeah, so I only have direct cognitive relations to things that are present to me. Yeah. In fact, I think the relation of subject and object, which I call acquaintance, is simply the converse of the relation of object and subject, which constitutes presentation. Presentation givenness, you might think. That is to say that S has acquaintance with O is essentially the same thing as to say that O is presented to S. The word acquaintance is designated to emphasize more than the word presentation, the relational character of the fact with which we are concerned. Now, I think today you've got a lot of people who are sort of have a vaguely Russellian picture here, who do have the idea of a sort of something like direct cognitive relation, which is supposed to be a two-place relation between a mind and some object, but without thinking that this essentially or necessarily involves presentation. There are ways of being directly cognitively related to things that don't entail the things being present to you. Yeah, so I can think about Zubaydah. Zubaydah is in the other room. Zubaydah isn't present to me, but according to this new view of acquaintance, a sort of more relaxed view, I can have a direct cognitive relation to Zubaydah when I think about her. Yeah, she doesn't need to be present for me in order to do this. Yeah. Although there is, to my mind, a danger that in speaking of presentations, we may so emphasize the object as to lose sight of the subject. So if we just talk about presentation, the acquaintance is essentially involves a subject and an object and a relation. Yeah, it's a two-place relation between a subject and an object. And so it's going to turn out that if he's got a very narrow conception of acquaintance, so most of our knowledge of the world is not by acquaintance, but by description. So this distinction between knowledge by acquaintance and knowledge by description, I guess you've all read on denoting. Have you read that in some class? Like, this is probably the most influential text of analytic philosophy. It's where Russell gives his theory of descriptions. The King of France. Have you come across the King of France?
I think we kind of read it with Ken in epistemology, or at least mentioned it somehow.
Yeah, so, we have knowledge by acquaintance, and knowledge by acquaintance is going to be something like this is red. Yeah, where this points to some object that's given to you. And for Russell, the object can't be a physical object, it's going to be some sense data. So you attend to a kind of patch of your visual field and think this is red. And that's going to be knowledge by acquaintance. And I think Russell thinks that knowledge by acquaintance is basically infallible. Yeah, you can't be mistaken. Yeah, it's just, yeah. And knowledge by acquaintance presupposes that you're acquainted with both F and A. Yeah, in order to know that this is red, you have to know what this is, a patch in your visual a point in your visual field. You're acquainted with that point in your visual field, and you have to know what redness is. You're acquainted with redness. Yeah, sounds weird. Most of our knowledge is, though, by description. Yeah, so the King of France is bald. There is no King of France, but what this sentence means is that there exists an X such that X is the King of France and X is bald. And there's only one X. That's basically the theory of description. So according to Russell, because I'm only directly acquainted with my sense data, I'm not acquainted with Zubaydah, I'm not acquainted with physical objects. I only know physical objects through description. Yeah, so my understanding of the physical object is going to be some complex description. So, for example, that I have a certain experience, and then I can have the thought, the cause of this experience. Yeah, and the cause of this experience is a table. The cause of this experience is is something real. I don't know whether we want to think that there exists an X such that X is the cause of this experience, blah, blah, blah. There's only one X, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, so our knowledge of the world and physical objects is knowledge by description. Yeah, and to understand these sentences requires acquaintance with the properties F and G, but not with the denotation, not with the object. Yeah, so I have to know in order to understand. So every proposition that we can understand must be composed wholly of constituents with which we are acquainted. Yep, so the King of France is bald. I can understand it, but there is no King of France. So what am I acquainted with? Well, I'm acquainted with the property of being a king and being a King of France. I know what that property means. I'm acquainted with the property of baldness, something like that. Yeah, and so that's all I need to be acquainted with to understand these sort of descriptions. But this is just a little summary of the theory of relations. If you're interested in analytic philosophy, you should sort of know this. If you're not, if you're interested and you don't know it, just have a look. So what does Russell think we're acquainted with? So we're acquainted with sense data. So I'm acquainted with immediate sensory experience. Yeah. And I take it our acquaintance with sense data we might think of as something like sensation. Yeah. So we have I have a sensation of pain, I have a sensation of redness in some point of my visual field. These are things that I'm acquainted with, and this sort of acquaintance is we call sensation. It's going to turn out, though, that we're not acquainted with tables and chairs. I'm not acquainted with Zubaydah, and I'm not acquainted with the objects posited by physics. So our knowledge of atoms and quarks is knowledge by description. These are posited objects that occur in theories. Russell thinks, so, that in addition to being acquainted with sense data, we always also need to be acquainted with relations. Yeah, so to understand this is red, I have to be acquainted with this, but I also have to be, somehow I have to know what redness is. To experience something as to the left, you know, the black patch is to the right of the yellow patch in my visual field. I understand that. To understand that, I have to understand the relation of being to the left of. And so somehow I've got to be acquainted with, to understand this is red, this is black, I have to be acquainted through sensation with something in my visual field. But then I also need to be acquainted with the universal, the concept of blackness. I have to be acquainted not just with particulars, but in order to understand language, Russell thinks, I need to be acquainted with properties and relations, which are going to be thought of as universals. That Russell thinks that we have to also be acquainted with acquaintance. Yeah, and so this you might think of as something like self-consciousness. Yeah, so when I experience an object, I experience the object, but I also experience my experience of the object. Now, my experience of the object is going to be acquaintance with the object, and experience and experience is going to be acquaintance with the experience. And so this suggests that one of the things we're acquainted with is the relation of acquaintance. And then you might think, well, and it's through being acquainted with acquaintance, experiencing our own experiencing, that this gives us a sort of tacit or some sort of acquaintance with ourselves. Yeah, so I'm acquainted with myself through the experience of experiencing objects. Yeah, but the experiencing of an object involves the relation of acquaintance. And the sort of thought is that in order to experience a relation, you have to have some grasp of the things related. So I have a sensation of I feel pain. I have this sensation of pain. The sensation of pain is a relation between a subject and an object, where the object is something like a feeling of pain. And insofar as I'm acquainted with my own acquaintance, I experience my own experiencing, that I'm acquainted with the acquaintance relation. And insofar as the acquaintance relation is a relationship between a subject and an object, I'm acquainted with myself as subject. Yeah, so this is kind of Russell's account of our acquaintance with ourselves. So I know myself. I have some acquaintance with the I as subject. This is something, of course, that Kant famously rejects. But he says we're not acquainted with other minds. Yeah, so I'm not even acquainted with Zubeide's body. Yeah, so it's unlikely I'm going to be acquainted with her mind. Yeah, so we have no direct contact with the minds of other people. We have, we don't even have direct acquaintance with other people's bodies. Yeah, the most you can hope for is, you have some pleasant sensations that you ascribe to the body of another, and then somehow through that you can kind of posit another mind. And so Russell ended up being having real problems with other minds. It ends up being a really extreme form, I take it, of Cartesianism. The early Russell thought that we were acquainted with the past. So one thing we might think about, what about memory? And you might think memory involves some sort of direct relation to past experiences. The later Russell came to reject this and think that that we're only acquainted with what's present to us, because acquaintance is a form of presentation, and we can only be acquainted with what's present. And therefore, we don't have any acquaintance with the past, which kind of pushes us to, Russell was just pushed into a more extreme, increasingly extreme sort of solipsism. Yeah. So one of the things that in the Tractatus is Wittgenstein seems to endorse a certain form of solipsism. Though his solipsism might be more influenced by Schopenhauer, maybe, rather than Russell, but there's a sort of strong sort of solipsism. Now, two things that I think are interesting is that one of the things that Russell thinks that we have to be acquainted with, so like, I'm not acquainted with, so this, just think how crazy this is. I'm not acquainted with Zubeide, even though I'm married to her. Yeah, I just know, I know my wife through description, but I'm acquainted with particulars, universal, and I'm acquainted with logical form. What the hell is logical form? I don't even know what logical form is. But Russell thinks that I know logical form better than I know my wife. Yeah, this is the picture. Yeah, so he says one thing we have is we have acquaintance with logical form, whatever its ultimate analysis may be. This is a primitive constituent of our experience, and is presupposed not only in explicit knowledge of logic, but in any understanding of a proposition, otherwise than by actual acquaintance with the complex whose existence it asserts. So the acquaintance with logical form is necessary to explain how we're capable of understanding false propositions. Yeah, for propositions that are true, the objects are sort of combined in reality. So we don't need to understand the kind of form of combination. But I think for false propositions, we can understand propositions that are false. And I think that Russell comes to think that the only way we can understand false propositions is if we have this something like acquaintance with logical form. So this is the kind of thing I want to look at in Russell. Another thing has got to do with complexes. So there's a question about the degree to which Russell and also Wittgenstein are in some sense atomists. Yeah, so so when I see this next to this, what am I acquainted with? Yeah, so one thing you might think is you're acquainted with a complex object. I'm acquainted with complexes such as A's being to the left of B. And that's a kind of complex that has A, B, and the relation of being to the left of as constituents somehow. And so that in experience, what I'm immediately acquainted with are complexes. Yeah. And so Russell thought that the direct sensible object is complex and contains parts with spatial relations. But the sort of later view, the sort of atomistic view, the sort of view of logical atomism, is that we're only acquainted with particulars. And then we make judgments about complexes, which kind of gives us a distinction between something like sensation of particulars and perception of facts, where facts are essentially complexes, whereas the things we're immediately constituted are the sort of constituents of facts that are somehow atomistic. You don't need to worry about that, but if you're interested, I think it's sort of okay. So I'm doing this very fast. I'm just running through. But when we get to Wittgenstein, once we start working through, there's going to be points where this I think is going to be useful. So at the time he was hanging out with Wittgenstein, and Wittgenstein and Russell were kind of talking every day, and then the First World War started. And Russell went to prison for conscientious objection, and Wittgenstein went to fight in the trenches and kept throwing himself and almost dying, like suicide by Russian, but it didn't work. That he was committed to what was known as the multiple relation view of judgment. Yeah, so he says, a judgment as an occurrence I take to be a relation of a mind to several entities, namely the entities which composed what is judged. He says, e.g., if I judge that A loves B, the judgment as an event consists in the existence at a certain moment of a specific four-term relation called judging between me, A, and love and B. That is to say, at the time when I judge, there is a certain complex whose terms are myself and A and love and B, and whose relating relation is judging. Yeah, so me, Zubeide, loves, and Lucas are related by judging. I judge that Lucas loves Zubeide. Yeah, the relation love enters as one of the terms of the relation, not as a relating relation. Yeah, so what does the relating is the judging. So what unifies the elements is the act of judgment. When I think that Lucas loves Zubeide, I've got three elements: Lucas, loves, and Zubeide. And then I, as the judging subject, kind of bring them together. Yeah, so the unity is provided by the judging relation. So here we've got the idea that the acquaintance is a two-place relation between a subject and an object. If I'm acquainted with something, if I experience it, there's me and the thing I experience. One thing, another thing, a relation. Judging, according to this view, is a multiple place relation. You have the judging subjects, and then you have the constituents of the judgment. And the subject somehow brings them together. Yeah, so the acquaintance involves two things: a subject and an object. Yeah, it's a two-place relation between a subject and an object. A judgment is a multiple place relation. So if I form the judgment that Lucas loves Zubeide, then we've got a relation between me as the judging subject, Lucas, Loves, and Zubeide. Yeah. Now, it turns out this view doesn't work because it's not enough. Yeah. That in the belief that the subject is related to Lucas, you know, the elements need to be thought together in the right way. Yeah, we've got the direction problem. Lucas loves Zubeide and Zubeide loves Lucas. These are two distinct judgments, but the story we've just seen doesn't say anything about the order. I take it though that in the act of judging, that they're judged together in a certain way. Yeah, that we've got a kind of a sort of two plays relation here, and this, you know, so they have the form of a judgment of relation. Yeah, so there's me, there's Lucas, there's Love, and there's Zubeide, and I join together Lucas and Love Zubeide in this sort of form. Yeah. Now, Russell thought that in order then to explain what's involved in judgment, we need also to say something about the logical form. So he says, in every proposition and in every inference, there is a certain form, a way in which the constituents of the proposition or inference are put together. If I say Socrates is mortal, Jones is angry, the sun is hot, there is something in common in all three cases. So what's, you know, there is an element that these three judgments have in common. What is it? Well, they're all subject-predicate judgments. Socrates is mortal, Jones is angry, the sun is hot. Yeah, we've got three judgments that have something in common. What they have in common is their logical form. They're subject-predicate. I have Lucas loves Zubeide. You know, this pen is to the left of that pen. Yeah. The sun is hotter than the moon. These three judgments all have something in common. They all have the form XRY. Yeah. They're a two-place relation. Yeah. So he says, there is something common in these three cases, something indicated by the word is. What is in common is the form of the proposition. Yeah, not an actual constituent. Yeah, the form is not another constituent, but it's the way the constituents are put together. Yeah, but Russell thought to understand a proposition, we had to understand the form, somehow be acquainted with the form of predication. This is basically the idea. And this, I think, was what Russell, Wittgenstein, in the days leading up to the writing, or the years leading up to the writing of the Tractatus, this is really what's kind of gnawing at him, what is really kind of, in some sense, driving him. This sort of understanding of the form of the proposition. How can a bit of language have the same form as what it represents? How are we to understand this? How are we understand the notion of the form of the proposition? So these are from his notebooks. He says, there is no thing which is the form of a proposition, and no name which is the name of a form. Accordingly, we can also not say that a relation which in certain cases hold between things holds sometimes between forms and things. This goes against Russell's theory of judgment. And later, does the subject-predicate form exist? Does the relational form exist? Do any of the forms exist at all that Russell and I were always talking about? Russell would say, yes, that's self-evident. But, yeah, so this is kind of, Wittgenstein on form. So in the time leading up to the writing of the Tractatus, this is what was going on in the background. Now, I just went through in like 40 minutes what I had planned for like a week, maybe a week and a half. So that was a very kind of quick overview of what I take as important in the background to the relationship between Russell and Wittgenstein. Any questions about any of this? I mean, it's sort of quite dense stuff. Yeah, I mean, have a look at, if you're interested, just have a little look at the handout. I think it's sort of this sort of stuff about the sort of metaphysics of the proposition. I think this is what was really driving Russell and Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein, I think, thought he'd sort of solved something like this problem. Yeah, how can a proposition, how can a bunch of elements be put together in such a way that they can say something? Yeah, so in a judgment, you don't just need the elements, but the elements need to be combined in a certain way. Yeah, and I take it that his sort of understanding of form, of the logical, of the sort of form of a proposition, I think came from, so when he was, when, I think there are two things that sort of were central, that when he was in the trenches, he read about a court case in Paris where there was a car accident, and in the court, they built a model of the street. Yeah, and you had a model of the accident with certain figures representing the car, other figures representing the people on the street, and he thought that this gave us a sort of understanding of this sort of relation of picturing, that the relations between the elements in the model are the same, in some sense of the same, as the relations between the objects they're picturing. Yeah, and the possibilities of moving things in the model correspond to the way in which things could have been in reality. Yeah, so I think the trick here with a model is that a model is something, is a physical object, yeah, that in some sense has the same elements of the picture or of the model can stand to the things represented, and then the way in which things can be transformed in the model correspond to all the possible ways things could have been in reality. Yeah, and so the form of a model has got to do with all of the different ways it could be transformed. Yeah, and what allows a model to be a model of something is if there's some way in which the ways in which things can be changed in the model correspond to the way things could have possibly been or could possibly be in reality. Now, I'm not sure how clear that was. And so he says, in a proposition, a world is, as it were, put together experimentally. As when in the law court in Paris, a motor car accident is represented by means of dolls. So this is something from Wittgenstein's notebooks. I think he was also influenced by what Hertz, so one of the books he read as an engineer was Hertz's Principle of Mechanics. And that Hertz offers an account of how models work in mechanical systems, and understanding the relationship between a model and what it models is, Wittgenstein thinks, the key to understanding how language is able to represent the world. And what we have in language is we've got something in the world that in some sense has possibilities, has certain types of possibilities of recombination that can be used to stand for other things within the world. And that the language can be a good language is if the ways you can reorganize things within the language correspond to the ways things could possibly be rearranged in the world. Now, so Wittgenstein starts off the Tractatus first by offering a brief account of his account of the way the world must be to make sense of this. He then introduces then has a sort of a discussion of picturing in general, and I'm using the word model. I think in German, the picture theory of meaning, the word in German is Bild, but I think Bild can be used as something like a model. And I think that really what's doing the work is the idea that it's something like the model theory of meaning. And then, so he's going to offer an account of picturing and how pictures work, and pictures work by being models of reality. And then he's going to kind of then try and show that we can think of propositions in this way, that bits of language can be thought of as working in the same way that models do. Yeah, so in order to understand language, we first of all will have to kind of understand how models work. And I think the two models that he's thinking of are this law court case that I think was very important for him. And secondly, what Hertz has to say about dynamic models. And I've got this on the handout. So next class, I'm going to talk a little bit about models. And then we're going to start working through the kind of first bit of the Tractatus. And so the ones and early twos are about the world, what the world is. And then in section 2, he then kind of turns to the question of pictures or models. How do pictures work? And then in section 3, we get the idea that sentences or propositions are best thought of as pictures in the sense that he's sort of discussed in number 2. Yeah, so we have a brief account of the nature of the world. Then we have a discussion of pictures and how pictures or models work. And then we have the idea that the best way of thinking about thoughts or sentences is in terms of models. That's basically the sort of story. And then it gets sort of difficult. Yeah, so in section 4 and 5 and 6, we then start getting into logic and mathematics and how to understand the sort of how to understand logic and logically complex propositions. Yeah. Okay, so I think that's enough for today. Wittgenstein's quite dense, Russell's quite dense. I think the only person I can see is Dilde. Do you have any questions or?
No, thank you.
Okay, yeah, I mean, if anyone, I don't know who else is there, but yeah, if you have any questions. For next class, I don't know how much time you've got. I mean, if you haven't got very much time, just read this handout from Wittgenstein, and I think that's 2 pages. If you've got more time, read the whole Tractatus, but I don't know how much time you've got. But if you only got a limited amount of time, you could just read through the bits I've excerpted, because that's what I'm going to talk about next class. You might want to, one thing about Wittgenstein is that in order to understand the parts, you need to sort of understand the whole, but you can't understand the whole without going through the parts. So I think the best way of going through Wittgenstein is to first of all get a kind of a sketch of something like a big picture, and you've got some idea of what the big picture is, and then you can go through and read and kind of get some idea of the details. So what I want to do to begin with is to give you the sort of big picture of 1, 2, and 3. And I think for an undergraduate class, that if you come away with sort of an understanding of 1, 2, and 3, which is his account of the world, his account of picturing, and his account of sentences as pictures, then you've really broken the back and you've understood, you know, a central part. The next, after this, it gets more difficult because you get his understanding of logic. I think there's some really fun stuff there. But if you come away from this class and you sort of understand 1, 2, and 3, I'll be happy. Yeah, if we've got time, we'll spend some time looking a bit further on. And there's some difficult stuff there, but I think it's more difficult. And if you don't understand it, that's not a big deal. But if you get, maybe there's bits of it that will make a bit of sense. I think the claim that you know, he thinks that all truths are either empirical truth or they're sort of analytic. And analytic truths aren't really truths in some sense. They're because they don't say anything. Yeah, an analytic statement doesn't tell you anything. You don't learn anything through an analytic statement. So he thinks that they're the only, yeah, there's nothing in between. And I think this creates a problem for claims about, say, causation. Yeah, so when you have causal claims, what's going on here? Yeah, and so his account of laws, I think, are quite problematic. So if we get through 1, 2, and 3, it's the kind of the stuff I want to focus on. Then later on, you get all of this stuff about logic. And then after the logic stuff, he has some really interesting stuff to say about the I and about solipsism. And so hopefully, if we have time, I want to make sure we talk a little bit about his views about the self and about solipsism. Yeah. Okay, so I'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.